The town square of Dry Creek was a place that had seen better days. Its wooden buildings were weathered and sun-bleached, the saloon's swinging doors creaking with every gust of wind, and the dusty main street stretching in a way that made the midday sun seem harsher than it already was. On this particular morning, the square was unusually crowded. Townsfolk had gathered for a spectacle they considered entertainment, a public auction. But this was no ordinary auction. Today, a young bride, barely out of her teens, was to be sold like livestock, chained and displayed for all to see. She stood on the makeshift platform, her feet shackled by cold iron, her wrists bound above her head with rough ropes. Her wedding dress, once white and full of promise, was now smudged with dust and sweat, the fabric torn in places from the journey that had brought her here. Her hair, once neatly braided, had come undone, strands clinging to her face from nervous perspiration. Her eyes, a striking shade of hazel, scanned the crowd nervously, filled with a mixture of fear, defiance, and disbelief. She had imagined a wedding day full of love, laughter, and hope, but this was far from any dream she had dared to imagine. The townspeople jeered and laughed, treating her humiliation as a public joke. Some whispered crude remarks, others shouted bids for amusement. A few older women shook their heads, muttering about the cruelty of fate, but their voices were drowned by the raucous laughter and jeers of the younger men. It was a moment meant to break her, to remind everyone present of the merciless laws of debt and social hierarchy in the frontier town. Her family, the very people who should have protected her, had abandoned her to this fate, their greed or desperation rendering them blind to the dignity of their own daughter. Despite the chains and the humiliation, there was a quiet strength about her. She did not cry, nor did she beg. Her back was straight, her chin lifted, and though her heart pounded in terror, she refused to let the crowd see her despair. Every sneer, every mocking comment, she absorbed silently, a simmering anger and sadness coiling within her like a tightly wound spring. She knew that this display was meant to strip her of all power, to render her an object for others' amusement. Yet she clung to the hope that anyone might see her as more than a commodity. From the edge of the crowd, a man watched in silence. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his sun-weathered face hidden partially by the brim of a wide hat. His eyes, a deep shade of blue, were fixed on the young bride with an intensity that set him apart from the jeering townsfolk. There was a stillness in him, a quiet contemplation, as though he were weighing every cruel word and every mocking glance. He had known loss, loneliness, and the weight of responsibility, and he felt an inexplicable pull toward this young woman, whose dignity shone even in chains. As the auctioneer called out the starting bid, the crowd's excitement grew. Men elbowed one another, eager to see who would claim the bride, their laughter ringing in the hot air like a cruel chorus. Yet the bride remained silent, her hands clenched in the chains, her spirit unbroken. The contrast between the crowd's cruelty and her quiet resilience created a tension in the air, so thick it almost felt like one could cut it with a knife. This moment, the humiliation, the laughter, and the unbroken spirit of the bride sets the stage for everything to come. It is the moment where her world seems darkest, yet it is also where the first flicker of hope appears. From the shadows of the crowd, the lonely rancher watches, feeling the stirrings of a protective instinct and a connection that he cannot yet fully name. The chains that bind her are more than just physical. They symbolize a society eager to diminish her worth, but they also highlight the strength of her character and hint at the possibility of rescue, not just from the auction, but from the loneliness and despair that has haunted her entire life. From the edge of the dusty town square, partially shaded by the wide brim of his weathered hat, the rancher stood silently, his boots sinking slightly into the loose dirt with each small shift of weight. He had seen hardship in his life, more than most could endure in a lifetime. The early death of his wife to a fever that left him with a son to raise alone. The endless toil of managing a ranch in unforgiving terrain, and the gnawing ache of loneliness that seemed to grow sharper with each passing year. Yet nothing in his memory had prepared him for the scene before him, the young bride chained and auctioned as Tevez. If she were livestock, her dignity and spirit on full display despite the cruel laughter of the townspeople. He had heard the whispers as he approached the town earlier that morning. Words like worthless and sold off had drifted to him in the wind, mingling with the cries of the auctioneer and the mockery of the crowd. But as he watched the young woman stand tall, her eyes steady even as the chains bit into her wrists, he felt something stir inside him, an emotion that was not entirely pity, not entirely anger, but a profound recognition of injustice. He knew what it meant to lose control over the course of one's own life, to be at the mercy of others' whims. And seeing her in such a vulnerable state resonated with the quiet sorrows he had carried for years. He studied her carefully, noticing small details that others overlooked, the way she held her shoulders, refusing to bend under the weight of her chains, the way her jaw tightened when a particularly cruel bidder shouted, the tiny flare of defiance in her eyes that told him she had not given up hope. It was in these moments that he felt the first threads of connection, a silent understanding that transcended the noise of the auction and the cruelty of the crowd. Here was someone who had suffered, yes, but who refused to surrender her dignity, and in that, he saw a reflection of his own struggle against the harshness of life. As the bidding continued, he remained apart, his hands resting lightly on the brim of his hat. He observed the townsfolk with a mixture of disgust and calculation. Some were laughing heartlessly, intoxicated by the sense of power and control they wielded over another human being. Others were hesitant, whispering among themselves, uncertain if the spectacle was right, yet unwilling to defy the mob. The rancher felt a surge of protective instinct rise within him, an instinct that had lain dormant for years as he focused solely on survival and providing for his son. For the first time in a long while, he considered intervening not with violence, necessarily, but with decisive action that could shift the balance in her favor. His thoughts also drifted to his son, a young boy growing up in isolation and longing for companionship. The rancher realized that beyond rescuing the bride from immediate danger, there was also a deeper need: someone who could bring warmth, guidance, and care into their small, lonely household. In a strange, instinctual way, he imagined the bride not just as a victim of circumstance, but as someone whose presence could mend the quiet emptiness that had taken root in his home. This realization gave him courage. The longer he watched, the more he felt the invisible chains of the auction tighten around her, not just the literal iron binding her wrists, but the social chains of cruelty, expectation, and abandonment. And with each laugh and sneer from the crowd, his resolve grew strong. As the auctioneer's voice droned on in the background, listing bids and mocking the bride, the rancher's gaze remained fixed on her. Yet behind his steady eyes, his mind drifted back to a time long ago, to the quiet cabin that had once been filled with warmth and laughter. He remembered the day he had married his late wife, how radiant she had looked in her simple dress, the joy in her eyes as they exchanged vows under the open sky. Life had seemed full of promise then, a life of hard work tempered by love and companionship. They had dreamed of a home together, of raising a family in the rugged frontier, of building something that could endure the unforgiving landscape. But fate had been cruel. A fever, sudden and relentless, had taken her from him when his son was still a toddler. He remembered holding her in his arms as life slipped away, feeling utterly powerless against the world's harshness. The grief had been raw and unrelenting, a constant ache that seemed to seep into every part of his being. His son, too young to understand fully, had cried inconsolably, and in that moment, the rancher had vowed to protect him no matter the cost, to shield him from the loneliness and loss that life had so ruthlessly dealt, years past. And the rancher threw himself into his work. He built fences, tended cattle, and kept the ranch running, focusing all his energy on survival and providing for his boy. Yet the loneliness persisted. Meals were eaten in silence, the evenings were long and empty, and the absence of love and companionship weighed heavily on him. Friends and neighbors had long since married or moved on, leaving him isolated in his pursuit of endurance. He had grown accustomed to the solitude, but it was a quiet, gnawing kind of pain, a shadow that followed him across the ranchlands. Now, as he watched the young bride chained before the jeering townspeople, the memories of his loss surged forward with startling clarity. He saw in her eyes the same fear and isolation he had felt when his wife died, the same vulnerability and quiet resilience. For the first time in years, his loneliness felt mirrored in someone else, and an unexpected empathy stirred deep within him. He realized that the helplessness she faced was not just her own, but something that spoke to the universal struggle of loss, betrayal, and survival on the frontier. His mind wandered to his son, small and timid, often yearning for companionship and guidance beyond the rugged lessons of ranch life. The boy needed a maternal presence, someone who could teach kindness, share stories, and offer the warmth of care that the rancher could provide but not replicate. The idea that the young bride could fill that role began to take root, intertwining with his sense of justice and his instinct to protect. It was no longer just about freeing her from chains, it was about restoring hope and love to their small, fractured lives. The laughter of the auction crowd brought him back to the present, and the rancher felt a spark of determination ignite within him. He realized that inaction was no longer an option. His empathy, born of personal loss and loneliness, had transformed into purpose. He would step forward, not out of charity alone, but from a deep understanding of what it meant to feel abandoned, humiliated, and powerless. He would act because he recognized in her suffering a reflection of the pain he had endured, and because he saw in her potential, the beginnings of a new life, not just for her, but for himself and his son. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine a life where the young bride was safe, where laughter was no longer cruel but genuine, where his son could grow with the warmth of a motherly figure. The vision was fragile, tentative, yet it stirred a hope that had long been buried under years of toil and grief. In that moment, the rancher understood that his past loss had prepared him for this act, that the pain he had endured had sharpened his instincts and his empathy, and that he was ready to step forward into a future that neither he nor the bride could yet imagine. The sun climbed higher over Dry Creek, casting harsh golden light on the wooden planks of the auction platform, illuminating the dust and sweat that clung to the young bride's worn dress. The crowd around her had grown thicker, energized by the thrill of spectacle and the cruel amusement of seeing a person treated as property. Men elbowed each other, shouting bids, some with genuine interest, others simply to provoke laughter. The air was thick with tension, dust, and the sharp scent of sweat mingling with the aroma of horses and leather. The bride, though bound in iron and rope, stood with a quiet defiance that unnerved some of the bidders. Each time the auctioneer shouted a new bid, she felt the weight of humiliation, but she did not bow her head. She clenched her fists in the chains, letting her knuckles whiten, and refused to give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing her despair. Her heart raced with fear, yet she found a strange sort of resolve within her. Years of hardship had taught her to survive, and this was just another test of endurance. Though the stakes felt unbearably high, the auctioneer, a thin, sharp-eyed man with a voice honed for the theater of cruelty, gestured broadly to the crowd, calling out the names of the highest bidders. Do I hear 50? $50 for a fine young bride." He barked, his tone a mixture of mockery and excitement. The crowd cheered, some whistling, others jeering. The bride's stomach churned with anxiety. She knew she could not escape the auction alone. Every glance around her revealed the merciless faces of men eager to claim her, seeing not a human being but a prize. Among the bidders, unscrupulous men pressed forward, trying to intimidate each other and her with harsh words and aggressive gestures. They offered ridiculous sums, flaunting their wealth and influence, and the auctioneer egged them on with glee. Yet despite their attempts to dominate, the bride's eyes remained steady, catching each bidder with a gaze that silently defied them. There was a fire in her expression, a refusal to be reduced to an object. It was subtle, but it was there, a reminder to the crowd that she had a spirit they could not fully extinguish. The crowd's laughter ebbed and flowed like waves. Against a rocky shore, some caught up in the entertainment, others uncertain, sensing the tension but unable to intervene. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers, with some wondering aloud if anyone would step in to stop the cruelty, while others scoffed, convinced that the rules of the frontier allowed such injustice. The bride, feeling the eyes of the entire town upon her, realized that her survival depended not just on endurance, but on courage, the courage to remain herself when every instinct might tell her to cower at the edge of the crowd. The rancher's blue eyes followed every motion, every shift in her posture. He noticed the subtle ways she resisted, the slight straightening of her back when the chains dug into her wrists, the quiet resolve that radiated from her even as the world sought to humiliate her. Each cruel laugh from the townsfolk fueled his determination. He saw the injustice, but more than that, he recognized the spark of life and dignity that had survived against impossible odds. This was not just an auction. It was a test of character, and he knew he could not let her face it alone. The auctioneer, sensing the momentum building, raised his voice to escalate the bids, his tone harsh and mocking. The bride's pulse quickened, fear threatening to break through her composure, but she held firm. She refused to beg, refused to cry, and refused to give the crowd the satisfaction of submission. Her resilience shone, a quiet rebellion against the spectacle designed to degrade her. And in that moment, the rancher knew that action was inevitable. He could wait no longer. The dust swirled around them, both the laughter, the jeers, and the desperate courage of a young bride caught in chains. The tension had reached a climax, a moment where the cruelty of the crowd collided with the unbroken spirit of the bride. And at that collision, a decision was waiting to be made, one that could alter the lives of the bride, the rancher, and his lonely son forever. The murmur of the crowd swelled as the auctioneer pounded his gavel and called for higher bids. Laughter and taunts bounced across the wooden buildings of Dry Creek, some townsfolk cheering, others jeering. The young bride's knuckles were raw where the chains bit into her wrists, and though her chest heaved with anxious breaths, her eyes never wavered from the crowd. She was alone in a way that pierced the soul, a solitary figure of dignity surrounded by mockery and greed. But from the fringes, a figure stepped forward, his boots crunching against the dry dirt, his presence commanding a quiet that the auctioneer could not ignore. The rancher's heart pounded in rhythm with his decision. He had watched silently for hours, observing her resilience, the cruelty of the crowd, and the unfairness of a society that treated people as property. Every instinct in him told him to act. This was not merely about compassion or pity, this was about justice, about correcting a wrong he could not bear to witness. He knew the townsfolk would mock him, perhaps even threaten him. But the thought of leaving her chained and alone was unbearable. He removed his hat slowly, letting the sun catch the lines on his face lines shaped by years of labor, grief, and loneliness. The sound of his boots on the dirt drew a few glances, whispers rippling through the crowd as they tried to gauge his intentions. Then, in a voice calm but firm, he spoke. "I'll buy her," he announced, his eyes fixed on the auctioneer. The crowd fell silent for a heartbeat, stunned. A few laughed, thinking it a joke. Others muttered doubts about his motives. Yet the bride, chained and weary, looked up with a spark of disbelief, a flicker of hope that she dared not fully trust. "I'm not bidding for myself," he continued, letting his gaze shift to the girl. "I have a son. He needs someone to care for him, to teach him kindness, to give him the warmth I cannot provide alone." His words were simple but carried a weight that cut through the laughter and noise. The crowd sensed the sincerity, and for the first time, a hush fell over the square. Men who had been bidding competitively now lowered their voices, some unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. The auctioneer blinked, momentarily thrown off by this unexpected turn. You mean you're buying her? For your son?" he stammered, trying to regain control over the proceedings. The rancher nodded, his jaw set, unwavering. "Yes, I'll pay the price. She won't be humiliated here any longer." The words rang with authority, and though some townsfolk snickered, others exchanged uneasy glances. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. The crowd that had relished the bride's degradation now faced a man unafraid of social expectation, a man driven by principle and purpose. The bride's chest rose and fell rapidly. Part of her wanted to reject him, to mistrust his motives after a life full of betrayal and abandonment. Yet another part, the small, hopeful part she had tried to bury, stirred in response to his words. Here was someone who saw her not as property, not as an object for ridicule, but as a person with value, a person capable of shaping a life beyond fear. Her heart, guarded for so long, dared to imagine what it might be like to be treated with kindness, to have a chance at safety and dignity. The auctioneer quickly adjusted, signaling the end of the bidding. "Sold," he declared, hammering the gavel down. The sound echoed across the square, finalizing the transaction. Some in the crowd murmured in disbelief. Others laughed nervously, unsure how to react to the unexpected outcome. But the bride, for the first time in hours, felt a cautious relief, the heavy weight of humiliation lifting slightly as the rancher approached the platform. He offered a hand, not condescendingly, not as a savior, but as a protector. She hesitated, measuring him with her eyes, assessing whether trust could truly be given. And in that moment, as the sun cast long shadows across the town square, a fragile connection was formed. Chains would be removed, and a journey would begin not just across the dusty streets of Dry Creek, but into the possibility of a new life shaped by hope, courage, and the beginnings of family. The moment the rancher claimed the young bride, the reaction of the crowd was immediate and chaotic. Some townsfolk laughed nervously, unsure whether to mock or respect his decision, while others scowled, muttering that he had no right to interfere in their cruel spectacle. A few men stepped forward, eyebrows furrowed, questioning his motives, their voices sharp with suspicion. "Why are you buying her?" one barked. "What's in it for you?" The rancher's eyes met theirs steadily, calm yet unwavering. He did not flinch, nor did he allow the question to provoke anger. He simply repeated his truth. His son needed her. The bride? still chained, watched this exchange with a mixture of wariness and relief. Her instincts screamed caution. She had been betrayed before, abandoned by family, judged by townspeople, and sold like property. She knew that people often wore kindness as a mask for selfish motives, and trust had never come easily. Even as the chains were removed, she did not immediately step toward the rancher. Instead, she hung back, her eyes observing, measuring, testing the sincerity in his gaze. She had learned long ago that survival required vigilance, and she would not allow herself to be naive in this moment. No matter how genuine his intentions seemed, the rancher noticed her hesitation but did not press. He understood that trust was earned, not demanded. Instead, he offered patience, a quiet steadiness that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the auction square. He knelt slightly, lowering himself to her level, and spoke softly, without the booming authority he had used with the crowd. "You don't need to decide now," he said. "But I promise you, you'll have a choice in everything we do from here on. No one will force you, and no one will laugh at you anymore." The sincerity in his voice, born of years of hard labor, loss, and solitude, seemed to reach a part of her that had been dormant for too long, a part that longed for protection and safety. Even so, tension remained. Townsfolk lingered, some angry, some curious, some judging, as though the resolution of the auction left a ripple of uncertainty in their rigid social order. A few older women whispered among themselves, questioning whether such an arrangement was appropriate, while younger men frowned, feeling the sting of a spectacle disrupted. The crowd was a living tension, a mirror to the bride's internal struggle as she wrestled with hope and fear. Every eye on her reminded her that even with chains removed, she was still vulnerable, not physically perhaps, but emotionally. The rancher understood this unspoken battle. He knew that rushing her, insisting she follow him immediately, would be a mistake. So he spoke again quietly, explaining the journey ahead, the safety of his ranch, and the freedom she would have there. He described a place where she could rest, where his son awaited companionship, and where she would no longer be an object of ridicule. Slowly, carefully, he extended a hand once more. This time, she considered stepping forward. The chains were gone, yet the invisible chains of fear and mistrust lingered, requiring patience to overcome. As they prepared to leave the square, whispers followed them like shadows. Some of the townsfolk questioned her decision even before she made it, wondering if she would trust him, if she would escape at the first opportunity. The auctioneer muttered angrily under his breath, displeased that the dramatic climax of humiliation had been interrupted. Yet the bride's eyes met the rancher's, and she saw a steadiness she had not encountered in a long time. He did not push, he did not bargain, and he did not seek to impress. He simply offered safety, dignity, and choice, the very thing she had been denied throughout her life. In that moment, a fragile bond began to form, tempered by tension but strengthened by the possibility of genuine care. The bride's mind raced, weighing her fear against the subtle warmth of hope she felt. And for the rancher, every step toward the edge of the square was a step toward redemption, not just for the young woman, but for himself and his son who longed for connection. The tension was palpable. The ride out of Dry Creek was quiet, save for the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the occasional snort of the rancher's horse. The dust from the main street clung stubbornly to their boots and skirts, swirling in small clouds around the wagon as the town faded behind them. The young bride sat with her hands folded on her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Her mind raced with uncertainty. Each mile away from the auction square was a step into the unknown, a world she had never truly imagined she might inhabit. The rancher, attentive yet respectful, noticed her unease but said nothing, letting her settle into the silence of the open plains. The rancher's son, a small boy of 6 with bright, curious eyes. peered from the back of the wagon at the woman who had suddenly entered their lives. He did not fully understand what had happened at the auction, but he sensed the gravity of the situation. His mother had died when he was very young, leaving him in a house full of silence and routine. Now, there was a stranger in their midst, someone who carried the promise of warmth, stories, and guidance. He studied her quietly, uncertain whether she was a friend or simply another adult he must learn to fear. As the miles stretched behind them, tension filled the space between the rancher and the bride. Neither spoke much at first. Words seemed unnecessary against the vast backdrop of rolling plains and windswept hills. The rancher respected her silence, knowing that trust could not be hurried. Occasionally, he would glance over and offer a small smile or a nod, signaling reassurance without demanding a response. The bride, meanwhile, measured each gesture carefully, noting his calm demeanor, the steadiness of his hands, and the careful attention he paid to the boy. Slowly, a cautious sense of relief began to replace her fear. The journey was not without its challenges. Loose rocks and sudden dips in the path sent the wagon lurching, forcing the bride to clutch the edge of the seat. At one point, a herd of cattle crossed their path, startling the horses and making the wagon sway dangerously. The rancher handled the situation with practiced skill, calming the animals and guiding the wagon safely across. The bride watched him work, noting the competence, patience, and quiet strength that seemed to define him. Each small act of care deepened her recognition that this was a man who could be trusted, a rare commodity in a world that had shown her so little kindness. Along the way, she glimpsed the beauty of the frontier, the endless stretch of prairie, the golden glow of the late afternoon sun, and the occasional cluster of wildflowers dotting the dusty trail. For the first time in months, perhaps years, her thoughts drifted away from fear and humiliation toward something more fragile, hope. The wide openness mirrored a sense of possibility she had almost forgotten, and the rancher's quiet presence suggested that safety, however tentative, could exist beyond the walls of chains and judgment. Occasionally, the rancher would speak softly, offering practical details about the ranch, the life they would share, and the boy who awaited her guidance. He spoke without pressure, letting her know that she had choice and agency, that her comfort mattered, and that her voice would be heard. These small assurances, repeated over the miles, worked slowly to erode the barriers of mistrust she had built. By the time the first stars began to prick the deepening twilight, the silhouette of the ranch appeared on the horizon, a sturdy log home framed by the warm glow of lanterns. The bride's heart beat faster, a mix of apprehension and anticipation. She realized that this journey was more than a physical trip. It was a crossing from a life of oppression and fear into one of potential safety, care, and perhaps even belonging. The journey home had begun as an escape from chains, but it had already begun to sow the seeds of trust and the quiet possibility of a new life, a life where fear might be replaced by hope, and where a lonely family could begin to heal. The first morning on the ranch arrived with a gentle, golden light spilling over the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields and hills. The young bride awoke to the quiet sounds of the countryside, the lowing of cattle, the rustling of leaves in the morning breeze, and the occasional crow of a rooster. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt the strange luxury of peace. The chains of the auction square were far behind her, yet she carried a lingering wariness, a cautious reminder that safety and trust were not easily earned. The rancher moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, tending to the morning chores without fuss. There was a rhythm to his movements, a practiced grace that spoke of years of labor and resilience. He did not demand anything from her, merely offering guidance when necessary and leaving space for her to observe or participate as she wished. His son, small and eager, followed her eyes with a mixture of curiosity and shyness, hovering at the edges. Unsure how to approach the woman who had so suddenly entered their lives. At breakfast, the rancher encouraged her to eat first, a subtle gesture of respect that did not go unnoticed. She was cautious but grateful, aware that he treated her as more than a guest or a possession, as someone whose choices mattered. The boy, emboldened by her gentle smile, approached slowly, offering a piece of bread with a tentative hand. It was a small act, yet it marked the beginning of a connection, a bridge across the barriers of fear, mistrust, and loneliness. The bride accepted the gesture with a nod, her eyes softening slightly as she realized that these simple interactions could form the foundation of something deeper. Throughout the day, the bride began to engage with the ranch in small ways. She helped the boy with simple tasks, teaching him how to care for the chickens, how to mend a torn cloth, and how to approach work with patience and care. Her voice, once hesitant and guarded, began to carry warmth and encouragement. Laughter, tentative at first, began to ripple through the cabin and yard, a sound both foreign and exhilarating to the rancher. He watched them interact, feeling the first stirrings of hope that his son might finally experience the companionship and guidance he had longed to provide. The rancher and the bride spoke in quiet moments as well, sharing stories of the past and tentative dreams for the future. She revealed glimpses of her life before the auction, the hardships, the betrayals, and the loneliness she had endured, and he listened without judgment, offering empathy instead of pity. In turn, he spoke of his late wife, the struggles of raising his son alone, and the emptiness that had shadowed his home. Through these conversations, a fragile trust began to form, a mutual recognition of pain, resilience, and the shared desire for connection. As the days passed, their routines wove together seamlessly. The bride's presence brought a new energy to the ranch. The boy laughed more freely. The animals were tended with renewed care, and the home felt warmer. Even the rancher found himself relaxing, the heavy weight of loneliness lifting slightly with each shared meal, each gentle conversation, each small act of kindness. The bonds forming were subtle but undeniable. A hand offered without expectation, a glance of understanding, the quiet comfort of companionship that spoke louder than words. By evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and painted the sky in streaks of amber and rose, the bride stood at the edge of the porch, watching her new home and the people within it. She felt something she had not dared to feel in a long time: belonging. The rancher joined her, his presence steady and reassuring, while the boy climbed into her lap without hesitation. In that moment, an unspoken agreement passed between them. They would build a life together, cautiously at first, but with the promise of love, trust, and family. The journey from chains to companionship was only beginning, but already the seeds of a new family had taken root. The unexpected bonds between the bride, the rancher, and his son were fragile, tested by past pain and present uncertainty, yet they held the potential to grow into something. Weeks had passed since the young bride had arrived at the ranch, and the small household had begun to settle into a fragile rhythm of trust, laughter, and shared responsibility. The boy had grown more confident under her gentle guidance, and the rancher had begun to feel the warmth of companionship that had been absent since his wife's death. Yet the peace they had found was about to be tested. Word of the auction and of the rancher's intervention had spread quickly through Dry Creek. Some townsfolk, still bristling with resentment over the disruption of the auction, saw this new arrangement as an affront. Others were driven by greed or curiosity, wondering if the bride could be reclaimed or if they could benefit from challenging the rancher's authority. One late afternoon, as the sky bled shades of crimson and gold, a group of townspeople arrived at the ranch. Their expressions were a mixture of indignation, suspicion, and barely concealed amusement. Among them were a few of the men who had bid at the auction, their eyes narrowed, jaws tight with frustration that the spectacle had not ended as they expected. Accompanying them were relatives of the bride, whose abandonment at the auction had revealed their own greed and lack of compassion. The air was tense, charged with unspoken threats and moral judgment, as they approached the porch where the bride stood with the rancher and his son. The lead man, a burly figure with a voice roughened by years of frontier life, demanded answers. "You think you can just take her? She belongs to her family," he barked. The bride's relatives nodded in agreement, their faces tight with indignation and expectation. The rancher, calm but resolute, met their anger with an unwavering gaze. "She is not property," he said firmly. "No one has the right to humiliate or sell her. She has chosen to stay here, and she will stay here. My son needs her, and she will decide what is best for herself." The bride's heart raced. She had feared this confrontation, imagining the recriminations and pressure to return to the world that had betrayed her. Yet, as she watched the rancher stand protectively beside her, she felt a newfound sense of agency. She realized that she did have a voice, and that she could assert it without fear. Stepping forward, she spoke, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I am not theirs to claim," she said. "I choose to stay here, with him and his son. I will not return to a place that treats me as less than human." A tense silence followed. The townspeople and relatives exchanged glances, unsure how to respond to a declaration so firm and self-assured. The rancher placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, a gesture of support without possession, signaling that he would stand by her decision. The boy, sensing the seriousness of the moment, clung briefly to her side, reinforcing the emerging bond between them. It was a small but powerful act, a living testament to the family they were building together. Some of the visitors, confronted with her resolve and the rancher's steadfastness, finally backed down. A few muttered complaints, others sulked in reluctant acceptance, but none could force her to return to a life of humiliation. In that moment, the bride experienced a profound sense of liberation, not just from chains or auctions, but from the fear and helplessness that had shadowed her life for so long. She had made a choice, asserted her autonomy, and been supported by those who genuinely cared for her well-being. By evening, the confrontation had ended, and the family retreated into the sanctuary of the ranch. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields and porch, and the bride felt a deep sense of belonging. She was no longer merely surviving. She was living with purpose, respect, and the quiet security of love and protection. The rancher's steadfast support, combined with her own courage, had cemented her place in the home and in her own life. The trials of the outside world, though still present, could no longer dictate her path. In this crucible of challenge and confrontation, the bride, rancher, and son had strengthened their bonds. Trust had been tested, loyalty affirmed, and love, tentative but undeniable, had begun to take root. The stage was now set for a future built not on fear or obligation, but on choice, courage, and the shared commitment of a new family forging their own destiny in the rugged beauty of the frontier. The first rays of morning, sunlight spilled across the ranch, illuminating the cabin and the fields beyond with a soft golden glow. For the first time in years, the small household awoke not to the harsh reality of loneliness, fear, or uncertainty, but to the gentle rhythm of a life rebuilt. The young bride moved quietly through the cabin, preparing breakfast alongside the rancher, whose broad shoulders and steady hands spoke of years of toil, resilience, and now of hope. At the table, his son chattered happily, his laughter bright and unguarded, sound that had been rare in the years since his mother's passing. The journey from chains and humiliation to this peaceful morning had not been swift, nor had it been without challenges. The bride had arrived at the ranch wary, her trust tested by every interaction. every word spoken by strangers and townsfolk. Yet through patience, respect, and the unwavering consistency of the rancher's actions, she had begun to feel the warmth of belonging, and the boy had flourished under her care. Each act small chores performed together, meals shared, evenings spent around the hearth had woven a tapestry of connection and trust. Outside, the fields stretched endlessly, dotted with grazing cattle and swaying grasses. The bride now, dressed in simple but clean garments, stood beside the rancher and their son, watching the horizon. There was a profound sense of peace in this moment, a quiet understanding that the past full of chains, auction squares, and cruel townsfolk no longer held dominion over their lives. She had survived the worst that society could throw at her and had emerged not broken, but strengthened, her dignity intact. The rancher, observing her from the edge of the porch, felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond relief. It was more than simply rescuing her from immediate danger. It was about creating a home where love, respect, and choice could flourish. He saw how his son had blossomed under her guidance, how the boy's laughter had returned, and how the bride's gentle voice now filled the once quiet rooms. The bonds they shared were no longer fragile. They had been tempered by trust, courage, and shared experience. Together, they had begun to form the contours of a family that was chosen, not imposed by circumstance or societal expectation. In the days that followed, the rhythms of ranch life carried on, yet everything was infused with a sense of renewal. The bride tended to the garden and livestock alongside the rancher, guiding his son with patience and care. The rancher, in turn, respected her decisions and sought her input, creating an atmosphere of equality and mutual regard. The small moments' laughter at a clumsy task, quiet conversations under the stars, shared meals where no one felt invisible became the glue binding them together. Evenings brought a quiet intimacy, the kind that does not demand words but is understood in glances and gestures. Around the fire, the bride shared stories of the distant places she had seen, tales of hope and survival that captivated the boy and softened the rancher's long-guarded heart. In return, they shared their own histories, the rancher's loss, the boy's longing, and the quiet resilience that had brought them to this point. These exchanges solidified the emotional foundation of a family formed by choice, trust, and love. By the time twilight draped the ranch in soft shadows, the three stood together on the porch, their silhouettes outlined against the fiery sky. The bride placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, the rancher's arm resting protectively around them both. In that simple tableau was the culmination of struggle, courage, and compassion. Chains had been broken, fear had been faced, and trust had been forged.